Great. I think we're going to get started, and hopefully the rest of the committee will trickle in. Welcome to our third zoning subcommittee meeting for the Salem project. I'm Eunice Kim, the Long Range Planning Manager with the City of Salem, and Lisa and Austin, if you want to, and Shelby, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Lisa Anderson will be the Planning Administrator.
I'm Austin Ross. I'm a Long Range Planner.
Shelby Giesar, Administrative Analyst.
And then the councilors and planning commissioners want to introduce yourselves as well.
Chris Hoy, Salem City Council, Council President.
Virginia Stapleton, Councilor for Ward 1.
Jane Griggs, Salem Planning Commission.
Josh Pollock, Planning Commission.
Ashley Schweikart, Planning Commission.
I think that's everyone, Eunice.
Yeah, I know. I was like, oh, I guess we only have 4. So we are back to talk about different zoning options to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm going to start with, again, just a quick overview of, what we're doing. And then today's meeting is really going to focus on the last 3 zoning options. So if you remember, we had 6 that we're kind of considering. And the first meeting was high level on the first 3. The second meeting was details on the first 3. And so today's really high level on the last 3. And then we do have, I think, 2 people signed up for public comment. And then we'll talk about next steps, which will be just our next meeting, hopefully the details on the last 3. So the Salem project, if you remember, is a multi-year project to update our comprehensive plan, right? It's the large framework that really guides our future growth over the next 10, 20, 30 years. It influences everything from housing to economic development, transportation, parks, etc. And what we're really trying to do is really make sure that we can plan for the future needs of both people who live here today and work here today, recreate here today, but also in the future. This subcommittee is specifically focused on different ways that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions through code changes. So we've talked about heights and density and parking. And today we'll talk about a few more of those options. And this really stems from the work that the council did to set a goal for greenhouse gas emissions last year. And the goal, as you all know, is to be net carbon neutral by 2050. And so just as a reminder, we did incorporate that goal language into the comprehensive plan, or into the our Salem vision, which we will carry forward to the comprehensive plan. But we know it's not enough just to have the goal in there. We want to see what steps can we actually take as we do this process to start implementing and move towards those goals. So that's really the focus. As part of the vision, we did take some steps in terms of the mapping to really concentrate and add a lot of mixed use along our transit corridors. We also established the idea of neighborhood hubs and kind of walkable neighborhoods. But what we're looking at now is, do we want to do more to actually encourage that housing near transit and near services beyond just allowing for it? So this is just something we showed last meeting. There are some draft strategies related to the climate action plan that are very much in line with the work that we're doing about really promoting denser development, mixed use development, particularly along our core transit network. And as a reminder, the transit network, or the core network, is really where the transit district, Chariots, has dedicated to really keeping service and increasing bus service in the future. So through this project, we're really trying to plan around that network. So the last, I should just say, we will do live polling, but the last meeting, we focused a lot on incentivizing housing, right? Like creating the space for higher heights, reducing parking if you add housing to a commercial site, and establishing a minimum density to kind of push up the amount of housing we would get. A lot of the questions that we're looking at today are more requirements so not just kind of incentivizing, but actually requiring. So I just wanted to kind of make that distinction. But we are going to do some live polling today, so we're going to test it again. Hopefully it works. It should be the same information or the same number as last time. That's correct, right, Shelby?
Yes, and I sent it in the email that I sent out this morning if anyone needs to find that.
Okay. And Commissioner Levin has joined us. Welcome.
Hello.
Do you want to quickly introduce yourself? Yeah.
Sure. Ian Levin, commercial real estate professional and City of Salem Planning Commission member.
Fantastic. So
You-
there's supposed to be 5 of us. Oh, go ahead.
Mine is showing that I've signed in, but I don't have, it's not showing up on my phone to do the polling. I texted the ECAM 301-222-333. Is anybody else seeing it?
Did you push A or text B to that number?
I'll try it again.
Okay.
I did it.
Great. And I don't know why that's going from 4 to 5 and back to 4. But I think there's 5 of us here. Okay. So these are just the last 3 options that we'll be, again, talking at a high level, kind of explaining what these concepts are. We did try to describe them in the memo, but obviously we can have more discussion today if you have questions. And the goal really is to understand if you even want to pursue any of these last ideas, and if there's any direction that you have in terms of the location or the requirement. And then we would come back, do some research and come back at the next meeting to kind of present maybe even a staff recommendation like last time and some options. We're going to take them a little out of order. We're going to do number 4 first, and then we'll go to 6, and hopefully it'll make sense. And then we'll go to 5. Hopefully that's not confusing. So the 4th option that is on our list of 6 is really about requiring multifamily housing in mixed use zones. So this is kind of a newer idea in Salem, and it would really, if we were to do this, it would actually ensure that housing was developed where we wanted to see it. And so part of the discussion is where would we want to do that if we actually did require housing. A lot of the areas where we have proposed mixed use zoning are areas that are currently commercial corridors. So if you think about Lancaster commercial, most of the development along those corridors are commercial right now. They're commercial retail and they're developed that way. So having a requirement, through redevelopment, for example, for housing would then ensure that some of that would go towards housing. So both of our mixed use 1 and 2 zones that exist today, for example, on State Street, they allow for housing, but they also allow for commercial, but they don't require it. And we're proposing the same right now for our mixed use 3. The mixed use 3 zone is most similar to our commercial retail zone, but it would allow housing outright. And so in all of the conversations we've kind of had in the community through the last year and a half, 2 years in the visioning process, we really talked about the mixed use zones as flexible zones where you could do office, restaurant, retail, housing, but you weren't required to. So this would be a change in the way we've even kind of discussed it. There is one overlay zone in Salem, that's the Broadway High Street housing overlay, that we do require housing. And so this project 990 Broadway did come to council recently, and there's a requirement that at least half of the buildings in this zone, it's a very small zone, it's only a few blocks, half of each building has to include housing.
Do you have a map of that, Eunice, available?
I don't think I do, but I can pull it up real quick. One second. Shelby, can you let me share my screen so I can share this map? Okay, Austin, I'm going to share this map real quick.
Yeah.
Oh,
I was like, I just made you co-host, so you should be able to see the option now.
okay, thanks. Okay. Can you all see this map? Oh, there's a lot of labels on there. So this is Broadway. Okay, I don't know if you can make it out. It's this pink area that says CO. It's between Belmont and roughly the split at Liberty and High. And so it's like literally two blocks where we require it. this is really kind of that north downtown area where we have done a lot of work in the past to ensure that that place really develops as a mixed use, pedestrian friendly area. So there's a lot of funding, for example, has gone to that area, infrastructure improvements. I think that you have the demolition and the assembly of properties, et cetera, et cetera. So it was more than the zoning that enabled this to happen. So I think that's an important thing to think about, because I know when we've had discussions in the community about this idea generally, there are some concerns about the feasibility of it. So, but I just want to say there is an example where we have done this, and there is housing that is being developed as a result of it. Austin?
Eunice, I had a question.
Great.
Is the proposal to have that same requirement, 50% of the building be, or is that a discussion for later down the road?
That's a discussion. If we even want to pursue it, what areas would we want to pursue it? And then, yeah, what would that requirement look like?
Got it.
And
Thank you.
I have another question. This
Mhm.
is Ashley. And this is, sorry to get like super academic here. But I'm interested in hearing from staff about, given that you utilize this example of 990 Broadway Street, which actually came to the Planning Commission for design review, so I do remember it. And that the city council approved this 10-year property tax exemption for the project. I didn't listen into that decision, but I'm really interested in kind of what the basis is for making that kind of, providing that kind of incentive. Because, if we did provide a recommendation that, the MU1, MU2, MU3 provides some level of housing as like as a requirement, then I feel like you'd have a lot more projects coming to ask for a similar break and say, well, they got it on 990 Broadway, like, why don't you give it to us? And so kind of, it's a slippery slope there then to like say, like, what is the defining principle by which we allow that kind of a break, and my mind, like, I just, coming from the, like, I came from development California, and like the property tax revolts that happened, in the 80s and 90s, like all over, and including here in Oregon, it's like, it makes me always really concerned about giving away too much of the city's property tax revenue, because it's one of the only things that, we have as like a consistent source of income that the city can then use in pretty flexible ways. And so I grow concerned when that is a lever that's used. And so we have to be very, careful about how we use it. So that's just like I'm interested to hear and kind of like what the rationale was for providing that incentive to that project.
So, Lisa, what do you want to? I was just going to say that. So, I know there was a discussion at council. I didn't listen in, so maybe Lisa could fill in, or councilors can fill in. But it is the MUTIP does have a multifamily tax exemption area. The 10-year tax abatement has like criteria you have to meet, and one of them is like providing at least one public benefit, which is pretty broad. It's like open space, common meeting room. And I think the discussion at the council, and please correct me or fill in the details, is that I think the council wanted more potentially in the future to get that tax abatement. Go ahead.
Yeah, Eunice, I think it's fair to say that there was some skepticism or some questioning of this program. They happen so infrequently, and it has to be within just this area that's outlined in this current map here. And the public benefit, and I'm going to put that in air quotes a little bit because it's really minimal. And so we actually asked staff to do some more work on this, and we want to look at this policy because we're not sure that it's really, for a lot of the things that you outlined, we're not sure it's really meeting the goal of it, that it was intended for. So we're taking another look at this at some point in the near future, I think, because it's I think it's just time for a new look at that policy.
And I think that, when we did State Street, we did a economic kind of feasibility analysis study to see, you know, would it pencil for a mixed use development to occur on State Street, given the zoning that we were proposing, the mixed use 1 and 2. And it did come back that there needs to be some financial incentives to make those projects pencil. So the zoning alone is not enough, it seems. Commissioner Levin.
Thank you. I had a comment related to the topic that we're, or one of the subtopics we're discussing, which is should multifamily be required in the mixed use zone? And I had the opportunity to speak with a property owner in South Salem who is in one of those areas that are proposed to have its zone change. And he's on a corner lot, and so he is the only one on his corner. Continuing down the street, there's several other mixed use proposed parcels, but his would be the single on that corner. And what was interesting to discuss with him was whether or not it was a concern or not for him, and his concern was more about what the neighbors were going to think of him, and the thought that his neighbors would look at him and think you could tear down your house, which he wouldn't do because he just built a house, but and build a 7-Eleven. And so what seemed to be appealing was the combination of the multifamily and some light retail, maybe not super intensive like a Quickie Mart, but something like that would be potentially saleable and okay with his neighbors. And so I thought it occurred to me that maybe a part of this conversation needs to include some complexity to the language. That if, let's say, we were talking about last meeting about the mixed use abutting residential zones and having certain setbacks based on heights to those residential zones, what if we looked at it the same way and said, if the mixed use abuts residential zone, then it does have to include some multifamily. And in those instances where it doesn't, where maybe it abuts multifamily or commercial general, then it doesn't have to include multifamily. I thought this seemed like an opportune time to bring that up, since that's one of the bullet points on one of the previous slides that we're discussing. And so I wanted to get that out early for conversation. And then also, I am about to walk into Kaiser Permanente South to get my second COVID shot. And so I'm going to turn my video off and I'm going to continue to listen. But their cell service is really terrible inside. And it's right inside the front door. So I don't think I'll lose service. But just in case, Shelby, I might have to log back in about 15 minutes.
Sounds good. I'll keep an eye out.
All right. Thank you.
I have a question. Did you? That's what he said. Now is he? I wanted him to repeat what he just said about. So multi-use if it's abutting residential, but not necessarily required if it's abutting commercial. Is that what he said?
I think that's what he was saying. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that is correct.
Okay.
So I think Eunice is going to give some examples of what other cities do, and then some different options, which, it sounds like Commissioner Levin has a different option he's throwing out. I do want to clarify, it seemed like there seemed to be some confusion with it in that comment from the neighbor with the neighborhood hub zone, because I don't think that these mixed use zones are applying to properties that are houses today. So we're talking about mixed use zones that would be on our major corridor. So MU1, MU2, or the new MU3. So we're not talking about a neighborhood hub zone, and neighborhood hubs are the zones that are being potentially applied to existing single family lots or single family houses that would allow them to be converted to small scale, commercial uses in the future. So I know there's a lot of people in the community confused about mixed use versus a neighborhood hub. So just to make sure.
Yeah, and we have a map that oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I have to actually go back and clarify because I did not have him, I did not look at his property on the proposed map. I went based off of what his comment was, which was mixed use. So I will go double check that. But
Yeah.
he is on he's on River Road South. I mean, literally his house sits right on the corner. So it's,
Okay, so he may be one in a mixed use zone. Okay, that's great. Yep.
yeah.
Austin, do you want to go to the next slide? I think that's the map. So that's just, we're talking about, again, the mixed use zones that are along or near the core. And then do you want to go 2 slides back? So we did talk to other cities and look through other codes to see, does anyone do this? And the answer is not really. A lot of places require commercial uses on the ground floor in their mixed use areas because their concern is, or their intent, I guess, is a little bit different. So we have a lot of commercial and we're trying to add housing, but in a lot of areas, in other cities, they're trying to make sure that when mixed use is developed or when these desired mixed use areas are developed, they include commercial. I did just hear from Eugene yesterday. They have a very small area near their downtown where they do require housing on 60% or 60% of housing, where they're trying to really preserve kind of older homes to match the character of a neighborhood, which again is a little different than what we're doing. They actually recommended against it of requiring housing. So it's not unprecedented, but I don't think it's very, very common. So we just want to let you know kind of the landscape in other cities. So the things that
I'm sorry to interrupt, Eunice, if I could follow up on that comment.
Yes,
What did they give a reason for why they recommended not requiring it?
Yeah, and they just said it was hard sometimes to meet the percentage. I think their percentage was higher, it was like 60%. You had to do housing if you wanted to also do some commercial uses. So maybe it was a high bar. We could set that obviously at a lower level if we wanted to.
Thank you.
And so we wanted to get your feelings. First of all, are you at all interested in pursuing this? And then if so, do you want us to take a look at specific areas? So should we look at intersections? Do you want to look at kind of corridors? And corridors would be more like, like State Street corridor, like a specific area along the core. Or if you're really interested in this, do you want to look mixed use everywhere, right? Or just the core network? So we're trying to gauge a little bit like, is there any interest in pursuing this? We could come back with options, obviously. And if you are interested in pursuing it, how narrow in terms of location would you want us to look?
So I guess my thought is initially that I kind of want to be as consistent as we can. So I like the idea that Commissioner Levin suggested about the sort of stepped incentive approach, where if it's abutting a residential area, we have one set of standards. If it's not, we have a different set. I like that approach. It seems consistent with where we're headed in our last conversation. So I like that idea. I'm so far not sold on the fact that requiring housing is a great idea, but I'm open to it. I'm just not convinced yet.
Yeah, I think the ideas of 1 and 2 speak to me as possibilities, and it would be because I think that would be you're creating maybe a more focused tool for and I guess like I would love to understand, and so this is something that you probably have looked at, but how many places near the core network do we also have like the neighborhood hub, like where the overlap is between the core network locations and the neighborhood hub locations? Because I think that the purpose of the neighborhood hub is to create some amenities that are walking distance from residential. And so, if we then say we are intentionally focusing residential within a certain distance of a neighborhood hub, like that we're incentivizing more residential near a neighborhood hub. I just think that those things would maybe align with each other pretty well in terms of connecting the objectives. So that's just a question that I had about how those things overlap the core network and the neighborhood hub locations.
I think, and probably Eunice will say this, but the hubs aren't intended necessarily to be near the core network, because the core network is on our major streets that already has services. So it's already served. So people that live near it are already served by commercial services generally. So the hubs are more spread out away from that, from people that live further away from the major streets, so that they have an option because they can't just walk to Center Street or walk to Commercial Street or something. Is that what you would say too, Eunice?
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think that the pushback we're getting on neighborhood hubs now is that some of the locations are too close to the commercial areas. They're like, well, we already walk to Commercial or Liberty. This hub is not needed. And so we are going to take another look at those hub locations. But
I gotcha. So yeah, then I'll just say reiterate that like I like 1 and 2 as options.
Okay. Commissioner Paula.
Okay, so every time I start the discussion, I have to put myself back into what the goal is to reduce greenhouse gases. And one of the major in all these reports and everything is, where is transit? And that's where you need to focus a majority of your multi-housing, because it's going to take people out of their cars, and it goes along the side of live, work, and play in that area. So I'm thinking to now. Tell me again what's the difference, the definition between the corridor and just the mixed use along core network.
The corridors, we would look at specific areas, not the whole mixed use along the whole core network. So we just pick kind of specific, and probably the corridors would be kind of the more walkable mixed use 1 areas, as opposed to, again, the whole core network.
Well,
3 is much broader.
Well, the whole idea of mixed use, and I'm going off of that, smart codes, model land development regulations. The purpose of neighborhood commercial mixed use districts are to accommodate mixed use buildings and neighborhood serving retail services and other uses on the ground floor and residential above the non-residential space. Encourage development that exhibits physical design characteristics of pedestrian orientation and storefront shopping, and to promote health and welfare by encouraging physical activity. So my thought is like maybe requiring it along the core network or corridor, whichever you guys think is the less draconian, but not number 4, mixed use throughout Salem. That would be, to me, almost like an encouragement as opposed to a mandate. But if we're going to meet the goals, again, we're behind it. We're in our total nation, we're behind the whole reduction of greenhouse gases. But a lot of the major cities that I have seen the research for, they are being bold, and I think we should be bold, at least along the core network and the corridor. And that's me.
Councilor Stapleton.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm with Commissioner Pollock here. I am all in on number 3. I think it's really, really important that we start building up that residential area or that high density living on our core network. And of course, imagining this overnight, obviously not going to happen, but as it gradually starts happening, I think more and more people are going to get used to it and actually look at it as a benefit because you are so close to so many different things like the core network, but also shopping and like that live, work, and play, like we were talking about earlier. So I'm all in on number 3.
Commissioner Griggs.
I think I'm repeating what Ian would have said too. Is I could go with corridors number 2 with a higher percentage of required multifamily housing, and I could go with 3 with a lower percentage of housing. So it's a staggered, broader base, but fewer units required. If that's one of those votes, that's what I would do.
I mean, this would be a poll. I think the next one's actual polling, but we can come back with options that look at kind of hybrid, if that's the kind of interest of the group.
Eunice, I think that's a good idea. Come back with the options.
Okay. So maybe we don't need to vote. We'll kind of look at a combo of B and C. Lisa, were you going to say something?
No, I mean, I think you have a poll here. Let's let people vote and see.
Oh, okay, go ahead and vote.
let's just see.
Might as well. Okay.
I mean, what we're not hearing yet, and I'm trying to see who's signed up to testify, and I think we got some written testimony at the first meeting on this topic, but I don't see that it was resubmitted. Is, it will be difficult for some people that own property and businesses if we say your redevelopment includes housing, right? So it would be people and businesses that's not their business model, right? That, oh, I'm just buying this site and I just want to tear down this old building and put in a restaurant or a bank or something. And we would be saying, that's great, but you can only do that if you have housing. And so there are implications with that. Funding is different for mixed use than it is for just doing a commercial development. We would obviously write in the code that people could keep and expand their current businesses without triggering this. We would put thresholds for that. But there would be situations, I think, that people will be severely impacted in what they thought they could do with this commercial property that they wouldn't be able to do. So, there's kind of a spectrum. So we've talked about, our main goal is to get more housing along the core network. And so allowing it is the first step, which we're proposing and the council's accepted in the draft vision. And then in the last few meetings, we've talked about, okay, besides just allowing it, what can we do to incentivize it? So we've, I think, agreed in this committee generally higher heights. In these mixed use zones, the setbacks are pretty minimal, except near the rear when you're next to residential. And we've talked about bringing back a cap on what that is. We already don't have parking if you're adding housing. And then we've talked about in this committee, not even requiring parking for the commercial if you add housing. So those are all incentives through the zoning code. So it's kind of a spectrum. So we've come from like right now you can't even do housing there without a conditional use. And now we're saying you can do it. And here's all these ways through the zoning code that you can basically add more units. We're doing these things to help you add more units. So that might be enough. And that might be enough with financial incentives, which would be outside of the zoning code. Or it might not, right? So maybe then we do require it. So just, want everyone to kind of be thinking about the spectrum and then maybe the trade-offs for requiring it versus not requiring it. And it looks like the voting is done.
Oh, Commissioner Schweikart.
I was just gonna say that was a good point that Lisa made in terms of like that this particular zoning category, that I think that our conversations are going beyond what the zoning code would perhaps state. It seems like there's the potential approach is potentially a combination of zoning and policy incentives so I think that's a good point to keep in mind in terms of like how this conversation evolves and how we end up making a recommendation. That if we need to be clear that like we believe that there's other routes beyond zoning change that where the potential to achieve the objective that we've been talking about can come to fruition. So yeah.
Is everyone ready to move on? So we're skipping over 5. We'll come back to it and go into 6 because it's kind of related. So this is the idea of establishing a minimum density in the single family zone along the core network. So we've already looked at, the multifamily and the mixed use zones along the core network. But if you remember when we did that analysis, a lot of the land just outside of those immediately adjacent properties on the core network are single family, bunch of yellow, and we do have a map. And so the question is, should we establish a minimum density along the core that would essentially require more housing if those properties are redeveloped? We'll get into it, but it would then concentrate more housing outside of just the mixed use and multifamily zones along the core network. So right now in our single family zone, we don't have a minimum density. I mean, this is not a picture of Salem, but like you could have one house on a massive lot, and we have nothing to say if you have a certain amount of land, you have to actually develop more housing. We have minimum densities, obviously, in our multifamily and our mixed use zones, but not in our single family zone. We looked at the existing densities of what are we developing at. And when we did the housing needs analysis, I apologize for the acronym H&A, we looked at building permit data, and the densities that we're generally developing at were like 6.6 to 7.3 net. And that means taking out the roads, essentially. What densities were we getting? And we did some research to look at our recently approved subdivisions, and it's very similar in terms of the density that we're getting. We have some examples too, and I don't know how much time you want to spend on all these, but our subdivisions really do have a range, because we are wondering, like, the feeling I thought initially was that we were getting kind of smaller lots as in recent years, but it is a range from kind of this is like 4,000, and this is the Pick Suite property, where our densities are pretty high. If you want to just kind of scroll through them, the North Campus, so they get higher and higher in density. Oh, lower and lower, I meant, sorry about that, my bad. Lower and lower density. Some Battle Creek Skyline, and I think the last one is maybe West Salem, where pretty large lots, so the density is pretty low.
It's also worth noting that our minimum lot size in this zone right now is 4,000 square feet. So that first example kind of shows about as dense as you could possibly get at Pick Suite.
We are somewhat, Commissioner Pollock, go ahead.
So the only question I have is, when you looked at those building permits, especially for West Salem, are these areas that it's impossible to have 4,000 because of the geographic area, because of the hilly nature? That's the only thing I worry when you compare those, because it could be very hilly area where you can't have smaller lots. So did you take a look at that before on that Eagle?
Yeah, that last one has a creek running through it. And so the lots have a lot of open space at the back, which impacted the size of the lots. A different way to do that could have been to put the creek in its own lot and had the homeowners association, right, be in charge of that, versus it being in the individual lots. And then the density would just count against the lots, not necessarily the open space.
Okay, thank you.
And I think only one of those examples, the North Campus, is actually near the core network. The rest of them are pretty far. So we're, again, we're looking at the core network, but we wanted to just look at kind of what were our densities generally. Councilor Stapleton.
Yeah, I guess I was just a little bit curious with the creek running through there. Obviously, that changes things a little bit, but do we have a comparison on the square footage of the houses themselves that are on those properties?
I don't think we do right now. Those subdivisions are pretty new, so they haven't necessarily had the houses constructed yet. I think the last 2 or 3 of those examples were just approved in the last few months. But generally, yeah, the houses follow the lot sizes. So smaller lots, smaller houses, kind of more affordable product, which is still extremely expensive in my view for a house. But and then the larger lots usually generally have much larger houses, more expensive houses.
Great, thanks, Lisa.
And I was just gonna say, there are other cities that have minimum densities in their residential zones. We are somewhat unique. And one of the reasons I know that is one of our Senate bills, 8, that is looking at affordable housing and housing densities, plays off of the existing density in the zones. And I'm like, well, what if we don't have one? And everyone's like, you guys don't have one? So a lot of cities do have minimum densities even in their single family zones. Kaiser has one of 4 dwelling units per acre. So when there's a subdivision, that's the minimum density that has to be met. Hillsborough is doing something similar to what we're kind of proposing in this option of having kind of a higher minimum density if you're near transit. So there are some considerations that, if you were looking at establishing a minimum density near the core network, that would say essentially if you're going to redevelop, you may not be able to do a single family home, depending on where you set that threshold. We started just looking at the 15 unit per acre because that's kind of where the state is looking at having a density requirement closest to transit, so within a quarter mile. And I just kind of put this kind of chart together. What does that look like? So if you're a 4,000 square foot lot, you could still do 1 unit. But as you get bigger, at 15 units per acre, you would have to maybe do 3 units or maybe 4 units. You could still, do additions to your house. You could still do an ADU. And if you couldn't meet it, we have an adjustment process. But there is that potential for then telling someone, like, if you redevelop, you couldn't just do a single family, or you develop, you couldn't just do a single family home. Will you do the next slide that zooms in? Yeah. So this is a quarter mile from the core network, and you'll see there's quite a bit of yellow. So the impact would be on not the homes that are there today. They could stay, right? They could do additions, they could do an ADU, but if they were to redevelop, or if there was vacant land, there would be a higher density required if we went this route.
I'm sorry, Eunice, could you repeat what the yellow was?
The single family zone?
Just throughout the city, regardless of how close they are to the core network.
Yeah, and then the buffer is the quarter mile.
Thank you.
And Eunice, what is that southernmost part? Because I'm having a hard time figuring out how south.
Goes to Kubler.
Goes to, okay, got it. So that's, okay.
Quick question, Eunice. As the transit system hopefully improves and we get more core networks, would then this zoning change along with the new routes? Does that make sense?
No, the way we have adopted our current, like, for example, no parking required for multifamily near the core, it is to the specific core network that is in existence today.
Okay.
So we would have to actually go through a process, as would the core network. I mean, as would Chariots, they would have to go through a whole public hearing process.
And the core network is not anticipated to change, really.
Right.
If it were to expand in the future, we would probably come to council and say, here's the expansion areas. Do you want to adopt the new expansion areas? And then it would get the benefit of, the no parking for multifamily, et cetera, the things that we've tied to it. So council would get that option in the future to re-adopt it.
Thank you.
So the question kind of is there any interest in it? And if there is interest, do you want us to look at different options in terms of what that number should be? We always put the 15 in there because that's kind of where we have talked about minimum densities from the residential or the multifamily and the mixed use zones. Mm-hmm. Thoughts, hesitations, questions, comments?
I'll say that maybe the idea of thinking, well, somebody couldn't just tear down her house and rebuild it is maybe scary or something. But there's a lot of land in Salem that's zoned multifamily and but just has a house on it. And so this is actually something we encounter a lot in planning. Not a lot, but people come in and, I want to tear this house down and rebuild it. And then we say, well, actually you have to build a duplex if you're going to rebuild it based on your lot size and the density. And like Eunice said, they can ask for, to do something different, but generally we're like, well, this is an area that's been designated for higher density. So, you need to do a duplex. And sometimes people are shocked. It usually always works out in the end. Sometimes they decide to just fix up the existing house or do an addition, or sometimes they're like, oh, I can do a duplex here. That's amazing. And then they do a duplex. So applying density to what people think of as single family lots and houses isn't new. It's just, it would, be more now to where, just be expanding kind of where that would apply.
Is it possible to go back a slide to the one where that one? I just want to look at that while we're having a conversation because I feel like it's helpful visual.
Yeah, and I think one of one of the things that we talked a lot earlier in this process through the visioning is that there was a desire not to rezone single family land that's already developed along the core network to multifamily. Even though I think in kind of an ideal new world, if there was no development, we would look at, having a mixed use center, having some multifamily next to it, and then kind of transitioning to single family. But the way we've developed, we have just a lot of single family along our major corridors. And, there's been attempts in the past to rezone existing single family neighborhoods to multifamily, and it's led to challenges. And so we didn't want to go that route. This is kind of a different way to getting to density along the core network without actually rezoning people's land to multifamily. Commissioner Pollard.
Well, one of the things I noticed after the housing crash and developers, development went to standstill, when they started up, it was not only multi-housing, but it was smaller lots. And because the banks were willing to, because of the affordability of the smaller homes, that the banks were willing to loan on smaller lots for smaller homes than these larger lots with the larger homes would stay on the market for a long time, and eventually, the bank would end up owning them. So one of the things that I really like about the 15 acre is not only the density, for the greenhouse gases and all that, but also the affordability aspect of it. So, I mean, if you could also, when you do your affordable housing and you get your toolbox of incentives, and one of which I understand in that cool running, or the analysis that you sent to us was that you could also do, or there's one of my model home things is also contracts with the developer that says, like, a certain percentage of these houses are going to be affordable, and it's written into the deeds that when they resell, they will continue to be affordable for like 50 years, some of them like 50 years. And that way, what you're doing is keeping, you're allowing for a builder to build smaller places, and then allowing them to stay that way for a long time, so that the future the future would really stay that way, and it doesn't come back afterwards and somebody just knock them all down and decide to go back the other way. But I kind of like the fact that the fact that the housing crash taught us that bigger homes are necessarily really where it's at right now. And I know that back here behind me, they were slated for bigger homes, but they turned around and made tinier homes, and those things, like, they weren't even finished building them and they were already sold. So I think the larger density, which is also the 15 per acre for in the multifamily, I think that's a good thing. And again, I think the counselor said at the beginning, let's keep things a little bit, consistent. And I think the 15 per acre is a good number. Thank you.
Commissioner Craig.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. So what I hear you saying is that if you have a residentially zoned property on the core network, it's vacant, it hasn't been developed at all, you can't go in and build your home that you've been dreaming about building on that property. You have to build a PUD. You have to have that density. Is that the?
It would be depending on the lot size. So the minimum density, if you had a really large lot and the minimum density was, say, for example, 15, the requirement might be for a duplex or 2 units or 3 units. If it's a smaller lot, you could probably still do a single family. It's really kind of where you set that threshold.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any lots like that near the core network that are undeveloped, that are single family residential?
We're mostly developed. We could look at that. We're mostly developed along the core. That's something we can bring back. How many lots are actually vacant?
Yeah, and I guess the flip side to think about this is, in thinking about if this may not be needed, is that, within a few months, hopefully if we get our work done on time, the House Bill 2001 rules will be adopted. And so it will allow people to do, right, duplex, triplex, fourplex, cottage clusters anywhere in the city. So in all this yellow area. And it could be something that the market just naturally does. And the market could just naturally organically kind of put that housing near the core network. Maybe that, makes sense for what builders are doing. So we might just, through allowing that in a way that we've never done before, see that happen already without having to mandate this density. So if you're on the fence about this, it could be something that we adopt the House Bill rules and maybe come back to in like a year or two with some data. So then there's more, so we can see if people are actually building that housing, and if so, where they're building it, and if we need to do more to incentivize that. So that's a different option.
Is that going to be one of our options we get to vote on?
It's not, but if you verbally say that that's your preference, then that can be an option.
Okay.
Commissioner Schweikart.
Thanks. I guess I would say that, oops, I was trying to lower my hand. There we go. That I would be hesitant to pursue that option of a wait and see, and maybe we'll come back to it, because I feel like, the Our Salem process that we're going through is supposed to be really kind of the key comprehensive overhaul of our existing plan and our vision for the next 30 years. And so I really want to make sure that we include this component in Our Salem, because I think that having that single document as the guiding framework for the city council to be able to use and say, look, this is what we decided. We came up with this and we want to use this for the next 30 years. And this is one of the aspects of it. So I guess in terms of how I feel about it, I really do think that this needs to be something we incorporate now. And if just personally, I'm go for it. I wish the core network was even farther south than Kubler, because I live farther south than Kubler, and I think this would be great down in Southeast Salem. But I'm all for it. So.
I agree.
Shall we vote? So I guess the pursue later would be D. Would be none.
Is there a web link that you can throw into chat so I can vote?
Oh yeah.
I came in late. Sorry.
Welcome.
I got it, Eunice.
Thank you, Shelby.
Yeah, me and Councilmember Phillips are going to be switching places because I actually have to jump off in about 5 minutes for work. So.
Okay.
I mean, I probably want to know more information because I'm late, but I'd probably go with B. And there it is. I got the link. Thanks, guys.
And I heard what Commissioner Schweikart said. That makes a lot of sense. I agree with it. I think, though, and I did vote for B, that it's kind of, it doesn't really matter. It's a moot point because that House bill is going to require it all over the city anyway. But it does kind of flesh out what our proposals are going to be. So I don't have a problem voting for that.
Great. So the next option, the reason we did it last is because it's related. So this idea is looking at, so we're kind of shifting off of the core network and looking at where new large subdivisions could occur. And in those larger subdivisions are probably going to happen where our vacant land is mostly in west and south. Should we, as that land develops, should we be trying to incorporate middle housing through a requirement or incorporate neighborhood hubs? So it gets to both walkability and complete neighborhoods, as well as mixed income, right, neighborhoods as well. So House Bill 2001, as Lisa mentioned, is already going to, we're going to talk about hubs first. Sorry, then we'll move. Okay, so neighborhood hubs, as y'all know, would be a new zone. And while it would allow single family to stay and all the uses that are in the single family zone to stay and be rebuilt, it would also allow for small scale businesses that would serve the neighborhood. So the idea is kind of walkable, complete neighborhoods. We've proposed more than 30 of them in the current proposed zoning map. We've heard again some pushback, so that we may be scaling that back. But in any case, and we're also proposing in that new zone some standards to then make it more compatible in terms of the heights, the design of the site, etc. So the proposed neighborhood hubs, as it would be a new zone that people, so we would propose to cite some of them, but also people could apply for them. So in the future, if someone said, in this area, you didn't say it was a neighborhood hub, but I think it makes a good location, they could go through a zone change process. So there's the market side and then the side that we're kind of visioning right now. So middle housing, as Lisa was saying, we are working on the code amendment now. We've had a work session with the Planning Commission and plan to bring that forward by the end of this summer, I think. Would allow but not require middle housing. So if you had a 7,000 square foot lot, as an example, you could do 4 units through House Bill 2001, but you wouldn't be required to. You could still do just 1 unit. So that's kind of the flip side of the minimum density versus the allowing. So like requiring versus allowing. And I just wanted to make that distinction. And we did, will you advance the slide, Austin? We have started talking to people kind of about both of these ideas. Some of the questions we've been getting is, maybe because they're both new ideas, middle housing and hubs, we should kind of wait, kind of like the discussion we just had, wait and see how the market responds before we start saying you have to do middle housing or you have to do a neighborhood hub. One of the other things that we have heard is perhaps there's another way to get to density instead of requiring middle housing by actually establishing a minimum density throughout the single family zone. So maybe it's not that high 15 units per acre along the core network, but it's a lower number so that as large subdivisions are developed, they have some flexibility in terms of where they want to put a single family for a duplex or a triplex. But overall, that subdivision needs to meet some sort of minimum density. So that's something that the home builders, when we met with them, prefer. So instead of saying you have 100 lots and these 5 need to be duplexes, they would like the flexibility to say, well, maybe this is a duplex, this is a triplex, this is a larger lot, this is a smaller lot. And they can kind of determine within that subdivision where the density goes. That makes sense. So would it still accomplish the goal of incorporating some middle housing, but it wouldn't be as strict, if that makes sense. Be more flexible for them. We actually think that's a pretty good idea. We've talked about it internally after the home bill has brought it up, because it's hard to say, here's your subdivision, and in the future, these 5 are reserved, and then to follow and track that. Commissioner Pollock.
So over the weekend, my husband and I drove up to Washington and a city called, oh God, I can't pronounce it. Poulbo, Polbo. And
Paulsbo.
Huh?
I believe it's Paulsbo.
Yes, yeah, Polsbo. Right. So besides the the congregation of really good shops and things, they have a whole section of what we discuss, what they call cottage clusters and really tight densities. And it was, and of course, with the nice design and everything, it actually, they had, the streets were narrow, but they had cutouts, some cutouts for parking. And it didn't seem overcrowded. And for that small town, it seemed to really have it worked for them. And it seemed like there are a lot of retirees there, but I think the closer density I mean, the larger density requirements look like really worked. And I just remembered because of the planning commission, the middle housing did come to us, and it brought to mind Bryce's discussion about cottage clusters. So the densities doesn't necessarily have to be duplexes or fourplexes, but the cottage clusters and stuff. So and then with the middle of the cottages having an open space, I think that's I think the minimum density in the RE zone is I think if discussed well with the public, I think it could be accepted. Especially with people not being able to buy the larger homes, and again, the market. So I like these, maybe not necessarily the 15, but I do think a good minimum density for our zone should be required.
And I appreciate the comment. I think and the reason we wanted to kind of talk about this after the last discussion is that, for example, we talked about, Kaiser has like, I think a 4 unit per acre. So it's not super high, but it does say that if you have an acre, you can't just have one house. And so we're like you would be better utilizing the land within city limits, right? Within our urban growth boundary where we want to see that denser development generally. Lisa? Oh, just kidding. Councilor Stapleton?
So just to understand, I guess what you're asking us is, do we want to go with kind of what Kaiser is doing where they have, 4 per acre or something like that, maybe even a higher number? Or do we want to, how is that, I guess, I don't know how to ask this question. Or go with the home builders type of example where say they have 20 acres and we just say you have to have this many houses and you get to decide what that looks like. How are those, I guess, the same, and how are those different?
Yeah, and so they're a little different. So if we were to say what we had initially kind of proposed is requiring a certain percentage of a subdivision to include middle housing. So say we say 5% of your subdivision needs to be to duplex, triplex, fourplex. And then they would have to designate those versus saying the minimum density generally in the RS zone is 5 units per acre. You can figure out how to meet that however you want. So you could have a bunch of duplexes or maybe just a couple fourplexes, right? And then as long as that density flushed out at the end of the day to 5 units per acre, it's a little bit more flexible for them to kind of figure it out as the market, right? As they understand those areas and what people would like.
Thank you.
And one of our concerns, I think, with just saying you have to do a certain amount of lots is middle housing, like Eunice was alluding to, is tracking it, and the fact that the person that does the development, does the subdivisions, not necessarily the builder. They sometimes sell the lots to numerous builders. And so if they're like, well, these 4 lots, then we have to track those 4 lots. And then if maybe a builder that buys it doesn't realize that that's the lot they built, and then all the other lots have been built, and they come in and they're like, but no, I sold this to a homeowner and they're just doing single family like everybody else. And then we have to say, well, no, you can't, because 3 years ago, the developer who's not involved with the property anymore said this is going to be the one for the duplex. And it's like, it's difficult versus when they come in and we can tell by the lots that they're creating, like maybe they're doing 4 townhouses and then, and the rest are single family, and we can just do the density calculation and be like, yep, that's good to go. And then it's clear what they're building because the townhouse lots are small and they're, noted as townhouse lots. And then versus just kind of randomly picking some of the single family looking lots and saying, oh, that one's going to have a duplex, that one's going to have a triplex, and then making sure at the building permit time that actually happens. So that's why we kind of like this idea that this very smart idea from the home builders as a better way to try to get there without kind of some of the administrative problems associated with it.
Commissioner Griggs.
Yeah, I can't think of a reason why we wouldn't go that route. You're still getting the outcome that you were trying to achieve. And so I think the home builders proposal is a very good one, very good compromise.
I agree with that, definitely.
Commissioner Levin.
Yeah, I wanted to give some personal perspective on this type of development. When I lived in Colorado, I'm a Colorado State alumni, go Rams. And during college and after college, I worked for a major framing contractor that built homes for Genesee, U.S. Homes, Kaufman Broad, and similar to our Pick Suite property in North Salem, very large 600 home subdivisions. And what I noticed in Colorado was that those larger subdivisions were master planned in a way that they were working around the development standards, so that very similar to what the Home Builders Association has proposed in this scenario, the overall development is taken into consideration. And then what they did was they built higher density lots in one portion where it was clearly the lower value lots anyways. And what it still allowed them to do was to build premium lots that had more acreage to them for the higher end homes. And the communities were sometimes large enough that they even had some of those neighborhood hub properties in them that became a convenience store, neighborhood store, or fueling station. And so I think what I was really impressed by, and what I noted, was that you had a good mix in a neighborhood of different demographics, but you also maintained that, not all of us are going to live in tiny homes, and not all of us are going to live along the core network. And the fact is that if we make all residential single family homes have to be tiny lots and efficiency homes, then I don't know how to say this eloquently, but none of the wealthy people are going to want to move to Salem either. So we have to allow some flexibility. And that's what I like about this proposal from the home builders, is taking into an aggregate view of a large subdivision to strategically plan, especially with the topography. One of the things that I also saw come into play a lot in Colorado was that subdivisions were built around a lot of the mini lakes that we had in the Northern Front Range. And so coming into the subdivision was the lower end lots where they weren't near the lake with a lake view or lake frontage. And then as the topography changed, they planned for streets and subtle changes that then moved into those higher end homes with larger lots. So I saw that work with really high success in Colorado. And I think it would be the appropriate conservative path for us to take regarding the housing. It does concern me to talk about single family housing and have no opportunity to build high-end homes. Where are tour homes going to go? Where's the incentives for lawyers and doctors to move into our community that maybe don't want a small property and don't want to live close in downtown? Maybe they want to live out, and so if they can't build the home that they're desiring, then we would lose them as a member of our community, which impacts our tax base, as well as the turnover of a dollar made in Salem versus made outside of Salem. So I think it's a really wise proposal from the Home Builders Association.
Great, thanks. So this is kind of a tough one. So we are talking about two different ideas here. Well, three really. So the minimum density in the RSM, which folks seem to favor, is 4, as opposed to requiring middle housing 2. We didn't talk a lot about requiring hubs. in subdivisions. And I will say that this is something that has come up in the community discussion about neighborhood hubs generally. I was just at a meeting last night where the neighborhood said, you know, you should require these in new areas so people understand when they're buying into those areas that there could be a shop, for example. So there seems to be some support in the community for placing these hubs. As again, new neighborhoods develop, they would be kind of more walkable potentially, right? You could still build a single family home, but it allows for a small shop or services in specific areas. So I know we kind of mixed them together here, but there are separate ideas. Does anyone have questions on that? Do we want to vote then? Sorry, my daughter just barged in. So you can obviously pick more than one here. Neighborhood hubs is a separate idea, and now I kind of regret combining them. Middle housing is B, and that was the requirement that we actually as staff think maybe the minimum density in the RS zone D is a better option than the home builders had pitched. Or none of the above.
So Eunice, on C, that would be, the clarification would be that it's scoped only for new neighborhoods, new developments, correct?
That would be neighborhood hubs and middle housing. So that could be, or, you know, the better way to do that actually is probably just vote for the ones you like separately.
Okay.
Because it sounds like there's more support right now for D. So the question really is, do we want to also look at requiring hubs?
What was tripping me up on the
Sorry.
A and B is the word only.
Yeah.
So
All right. Sorry.
I didn't know how
Yeah.
to vote.
Yeah.
Can they vote for 2 units? Can they text 2 letters and it will be 2? Okay, so if you like D, but then you also want us to look at, maybe you can ignore the only. You want us to look at hubs also in new subdivisions? Let's do A. But we can also
Won't
just
let you do more than one.
won't let you do more than one.
I just tried and it said you can no longer respond to this activity.
Yeah, I also want that. So I voted for D,
Okay.
but now I can't vote for A. So could you just like know that?
Just note it. Yep.
Okay.
I'll note it.
Same with
I'm
me.
sorry.
Yeah, it sounded like there's a lot of support for D. So maybe people just want to verbally say if they want us to look into hubs in the new neighborhoods. I heard 2 so far.
Yeah, I would.
Okay.
I would too. I would. The number 1, A.
Okay.
Great.
Great.
Sometimes technology is not your friend, our friend.
So I think those are the last 3 options. And again, we will, thank you, Councilor Phillips. We will bring back more details on those at the next one, and at least confirm. And so now I think there's 2 members, Shelby, of the public signed up.
Yes. We have Phil Carver. Phil, please be sure to state your name and address into the record. You have 3 minutes to provide your comments.
Hi, this is Phil Carver. I live at 1007 Newport Road, Southeast Salem. And I'm representing 350 Salem in this meeting tentatively. We'll provide formal comments as we move along. First, that's not on the agenda, but I would like to add an item that should be discussed, and that's general parking requirements. And tentatively, we're thinking of no parking requirements anywhere in the city at all. And the reason is that self-driving cars are no more than 10 years away. And when self-driving cars are available, it will be quite a bit more economical to not own a car and just call up a self-driving car to take you wherever you want to go. And so that will really, all these buildings that are being built will last 30, 50, hopefully 100 years. And so these requirements for parking is really going to be very antiquated within a very short fraction of the building life. And we need to really think forward on that. And this self-driving cars are coming along very fast. So on the questions that you asked, yes, we support requiring mixed housing along the core network as proposed, and seem to have a majority of the participants. We support a minimum density of 15 per acre near the core network, but we propose a broader definition of the core network that is half a mile rather than a quarter mile. It's very easy to walk half a mile. Takes about 20, 30 minutes, even if you walk slowly. In terms of requiring hubs, yes, we support requiring hubs in new developments. It's not clear what's meant by large developments. And we also support minimum density really citywide, and in the level of not the 15 per acre, that's obviously too dense for the whole city, but something like 8 to 14. You have to have if you're going to have a requirement, it should be a binding constraint. Otherwise, it'll have no effect. So you don't want it in the 7 range, which is really typical. But it really should clarify what's meant by large developments. And we support the idea of minimum density rather than requiring middle housing. It seems administratively more workable and more effective in achieving the goal and providing the best quality of development that people want. But we really think that the most important thing is that the minimum density of 15 per acre for single family really should be broader than a quarter mile. That's a very narrow definition, and especially as you get towards South Commercial, south of Kubler, it really should consider extending all these requirements down at least past Walmart. That's hugely developed along South Commercial, at least to Walmart. And so there's a beginning hub, a major commercial hub at Commercial and Kubler that really should be thought about as almost like you think about downtown. It's very super developed. And with Costco going in just a few blocks down Kubler, there's going to be like 5 or 6 major grocery stores and restaurants and all kinds of businesses, liquor stores and tire dealers, everything. So really think differently about the Kubler commercial interchange or intersection. And so south of Kubler really needs to be thought about differently, even though it's not part of the core network. It's really close to the core network. That's my comments. Thank you very much for having public oral comments. This is really helpful.
And we have Steve Anderson. Steve, please be sure to state your name and address into the record. You also have 3 minutes to provide your comment.
All right. Steve Anderson, Ward 8, West Salem Neighborhood Association Land Use Chair. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Appreciate it. A couple comments on your June 2nd memorandum. We talked about minimum height, and when we did, the discussion was, I brought up the issue of access to solar radiation and sunlight. This morning, sitting in the breakfast nook with sun on my face and a hummingbird feeding outside the window, there's great psychological benefit, but you're talking about capping this distance, and I think that's wrong. I think that you have to look at livability in Salem, and so as these multifamily high-rise buildings go into place against a residential neighborhood, you need to make sure that they have access to sunlight for their gardens, for their homes, for reducing of heat requirements. We worked with Lisa very closely on the Edgewater 2nd Street overlay zone and developed a good mixed-use, pedestrian-friendly model there. And I appreciated that we were able to respect the light and access to sunlight that neighbors need. So I would suggest that capping height is wrong. Secondly, as we look at the parking requirements, I lived outside of Philadelphia for 4 years on a government contract with MIT and Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. I lived in a townhome area because I needed that and I wasn't going to be there for a long time. And I was within 5 minutes of bus service or bike or train service to New York and Washington, D.C., which I took often. But we had one car. And my wife taught seminary. She went out to the Amish area, and we had picnics up at Marine, at Valley Forge. Let's get real. Salem is a middle community. People love the community because of access to the mountains and the beaches. In regards to what Phil said, I will disagree with him. People need at least one car to recreate in Oregon. That's just who we are. Access and promoting transportation within the city, great. But people are going to have one car. And I think the impacts are going to be in the neighborhoods. And this discussion is only on density. It does not look at the other issues of reducing carbon emissions. And when you focus in on one point, you tend to get myopic, and you may pick choices where you don't do trade-off analysis to see, does this really reduce greenhouse emissions? More time driving around the neighborhood to find a parking place does not reduce it. I would suggest that we talk incentives for, electric cars or, the hybrids, to make it possible that there are incentives. And I like the idea of the incentive model. We've talked a lot today about requirements. I think the middle housing option and what Lisa is doing there is excellent. And that will be a big help in the future. And I agree with the Home Builders Association. We should have incentives. The idea from 0 to 50% of density, you could get more incentives as you get closer to that 50% density. You could have a carbon tax or a carbon fee on new development, which says, here's the base carbon emissions for this development. And as you work through more housing, more open space, you get a break in your fee for your permit application. But I think we need to look more at the incentive model. Open space, we are working hard in West Salem on open space along Marine Drive to have carbon sequestration. These discussions have ignored open spaces within this density corridor. Density is important. It's a good model, but it's not the only model. And I think the perspective is being lost here in this group as you look only at that and you keep talking required. I think the idea of the Texas model of putting as many people into a building and crashing as many people into a place as possible does not work in Salem. Let's talk livability. Let's talk a general part of our community. Open space, incentives, and looking at the reality of what we're talking about. I will talk about hubs next time, but one thing in West Salem that we're concerned about is we're trying to develop the 2nd Street, Wallace Road business corridor, and we do not want to dilute that business corridor with people out in the other area. And you talk about market analysis. Some of these hubs will not work in Salem because we do not have the business base to support them. So I think letting incentives work there is important. So I would just kind of leave it there. But I think that this group has a good discussion. A lot of these points are good, but I would encourage you to look at more than just density and blend it together. think we need to talk about livability in terms of the mixed use and the middle housing. I think that is a great model to improve and improve work along our corridors. And so I'll leave it there or take any questions, but let's not have the Texas model where we take people across the border and cram them into as much space as possible and leave it at that. Okay. Oh yeah, and thank you, Lisa, Eunice, and Austin for coming to the market last week. We really appreciate you coming into the community and answering questions. That was a big support.
Councilor Stapleton, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, maybe just a question. Well, a comment and then followed by a question, maybe. Sorry, I don't have video. My internet is not great right now, so I'm trying. When Steve talks about these different ideas of density, but then also trying to make sure that we have a livable city, I struggle with that as well in these meetings. And I have to remind myself that this is about zoning. It's not about like the conversation about parks or open spaces or green spaces or those types of livability type topics. That's going to come later in my understanding. Am I understanding that correctly, Eunice? I just want to make sure.
Some of that conversation is happening, just not in this subcommittee. So not only is the climate action plan looking at all types of other strategies for greenhouse gas emissions, our Salem project is looking at way more than just density along the core network, as an example.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, maybe say that out loud to anybody watching. Those are things that I think everybody on this call has in their mind. We want to make sure that our city is well balanced and that the livability, Salem is a great place to live now. And I think we are weighing those, I guess, concerns equally with what we're thinking about as far as when it comes to really trying to make gains in the area of emissions and reducing those. But knowing also that those conversations are happening in other rooms, and what's asked of us today here in this meeting is how do we get at those emissions? And so I guess I want to communicate with Steve specifically that those conversations are, those different things are in my mind as I'm making these decisions, knowing that those are conversations happening in other areas. So I understand your concern, and I just wanted to say that out loud, I guess.
Great, Commissioner Pollock.
To address Steve's concerned about the shadow effects, we actually talked about setbacks, and the higher the building went, the shadow effect, that's where the length of the setback would be when it came to abutting residential homes. So we already discussed this, and in fact, I brought up West Salem because about the Edgewater and the Northwest Human Services issue and stuff like that. But we did discuss this already, and if you take a look at what the recommendation was for the shadow effects of the mixed use along abutting residential housing, you'll be very satisfied, I think. So that just wanted to say that.
Great. Are there any other comments or questions? If not, I think we have good direction to kind of do some more research and bring back, again, kind of some of the ideas that we discussed in further detail in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks. I
have a question that's more of
sure.
a for good of the order question, Eunice.
Okay. Yes.
If I could, this is Ian Levin. We're talking about zoning, and a lot of it is related to residential zoning in these subcommittee meetings. Are we going to discuss potential zone changes at any time related to other areas? There's a particular area of concern that I have north of downtown that has always languished since it was rezoned a couple decades ago. And our Salem project seems like an opportune time to maybe work with planning staff on a collaborative effort between public and private to rezone those blocks north of downtown that are zoned commercial office to something that'll actually spur redevelopment there. When and where would that be appropriately discussed?
Yeah, we were having those conversations, I mean, outside of these meetings constantly. So are you talking about kind of our draft proposed zoning changes and the interactive map and our proposals for changes in the North Downtown generally?
Yeah, I'm getting some questions from property owners. One in particular that's a client of mine, that has one of those property zone CO. And so they were asking about this subcommittee, and I was explaining to folks kind of what this is, what we've been discussing in the last couple of meetings. And so the question has now been brought up by 2 different property owners about how do we get this in front of staff so that this is considered as a part of this overall Our Salem project. So I might, if it's okay, direct folks to maybe just reach out to you, Eunice, to kind of start that conversation. I think there's okay.
Ian, is that this is Shane, is that the part that's the overlay zone, the Front Street overlay zone?
It is, yeah. It's I think commonly referred to as the Truett properties and some of the surrounding properties that were rezoned commercial office in the 90s. And they have not been able to redevelop or some of them reoccupy. Even with the intended grandfathered use, there's still so many limitations that my clients have really struggled with a property, and we've had 4 candidates that have gone through pre-app meetings and have not been able to find a path forward on the property, even though they seem to, on face value, fit the kind of the existing non-conforming use. So trying to figure out a better solution going forward on those properties, I think, is a pretty high priority for I think the Truitts as well as my clients. And then I think the folks that own property to the west of my clients also have kind of that same interest. So there's definitely some growing collaborative work between those property owners.
Yeah, and Ian, just so you know, we do have a proposed new zone for that whole area. And we did focus groups with all the property owners and worked with urban development to create a new zone and address those concerns. And that's part of our Salem proposal. So
what's the zone, Lisa?
It's called mixed use riverfront.
Okay.
So, the council's directed us repeatedly over the past decade or so to get rid of overlay zones generally, because they're confusing to people, because then you have two zones on your property, which is hard for folks to navigate. And then in that area specifically, we've already done some work to allow adaptive reuse of, buildings and industrial buildings to be reused for industrial use, even though the future vision is really kind of mixed use and less industrial. And so we're continuing on that path to look at ways that people can reuse those properties while also retaining kind of the vision in the future, which would be a mix of uses, and especially along Front Street, things that are oriented toward the river, public access along the river, et cetera. So we'll definitely circle back around to those property owners to let them know that the work that we worked with them on, it was maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago that we did urban development did the focus groups, and then a consultant outside of our Salem helped rewrite the zone. And so we're incorporating it into our Salem to be adopted through this process. So.
Okay.
Yeah, and feel free to just direct people to me. And if there needs to be another meeting or a separate meeting, just let me know. Urban Development is reaching out for us to all those property owners and focus groups, again, to let them know the updated proposal in terms of, it's been a while. So they're doing some of that legwork for us. Anything else?
You're the first one to get done early.
Oh.
Usually we're like, next.
I know, usually rushing. Yeah. I think our next meeting is the 21st, so Monday. So not this coming Monday, but the next Monday. We'll see you all back here.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.